approaches on certain issues, but there is this idea that you're either part of the regime, which is this kind of Western government collusion that's going to keep the failed project of neoliberalism going through brute force. And then there's just kind of this group, I think the majority of people that are seeking the truth, that love the truth. You could call it seeking enlightenment. I don't love that term, but we want to try to get answers and a restoration of the form and the structure of government that we once enjoyed. We might not have enjoyed it totally in our lifetime, but we know it's possible. And so we want a reset, and not the great reset. We want a reset around the promises of kind of Western constitutional order, where the people are the sovereign, where we have the rule of law, checks and balances, where our leaders they're not able to lie with us with total impunity. And so I think it's really exciting. I mean, I'm talking to people that 5 years ago we would have considered on the other side of the aisle, and we see things far more similarly than we ever have.
Yeah, it's curious. It's been a fascinating and intriguing odyssey for me, which I know that many of the people that have always existed in, should we call it, the conservative, libertarian, Christian spaces that I imagine you are more native to, always regard as a kind of red pilling. For me, Russell Brand red pilled by this, they say. But I feel that I've always been pretty vehemently anti-establishment. I've always been very pro-individual sovereignty. I've always been anti-corruption, but I suppose culturally I was, for example, moving through Hollywood, being in movies, participating in the world that is governed by the kind of metropolitan media values. And of course, I'm perhaps are aware, I'm a recovering addict. So certainly when it comes to hedonism and the kind of ideas you might associate with that, I'm certainly somewhat, I've certainly lived in the kind of spaces that are defined by that. Charlie, can we first of all look at a couple of contemporary stories like this Boeing, like we're talking about John Barnett's death by his own hand, or whatever you want to call it. It's very convenient for Boeing that a man who consistently testified against their safety from a position of some experience and authority is now unable to testify further. When you see a story like that, what's your assessment of it, Charlie?
Well, you can't help but think, is there foul play involved? Again, I don't know. I know none of the details. I know nothing, and I don't want to speculate beyond that. But, those of us that love the truth and those of us that are kind of combining forces, we see a pattern. And I believe God made us in a way to recognize patterns, and pattern recognition is important, which is when you see kind of unusual glitches in how things should operate. For example, I mean, when you see whistleblowers at the origination of the spread of COVID just disappear in mainland China, and we're just told, oh, no, it's just fine. Happens all the time that scientists just kind of just disappear. Or when Epstein, quote unquote, killed himself in a prison cell. And again, I don't know anything about this. It could just be that this guy was dealing with mental health issues and the pressure was too much. I know nothing about the details there, but it smells. And by the way, the same thing with Mitch McConnell's sister-in-law that's connected to the Chinese Communist Party shipping company. I don't know if you saw that story in Texas. It was, I think something Chow, where she just, I suppose, got into her Tesla and went backwards into a lake. And suspicious, it's being investigated as a criminal matter in Texas. Again, I don't know if foul play was involved there, but we're starting to I think people now have the courage to put two and two together and say, are there other clandestine subterranean forces that are trying to remove truth tellers, whistleblowers, or threats to their current power structure? And or do they just want to try to go back to this idea that, dead men tell no lies, or dead men are not able to testify? So I don't know what to make of it, Russell, except for the fact that in the new normal, when I see a story like this, I immediately start to suspect foul play more than just the narrative that we're being fed. And that is largely because we have been routinely manipulated by the mainstream apparatus, by the establishment, which is the term that I love that you used. And again, it could be that the normal explanation is the normal explanation. But if there's any lesson out of the last 4 years after 15 days to slow the spread, it's that there's almost always more to the story than what the establishment is telling us.
When there are paradoxes embedded even within that story. I wonder what we can learn from then. I understand that you, my guess is that you're sort of a pretty pro-Trump person, and I know in the media space that I operate in, Trump is regarded just generally as a hero. My own political allegiances lie more in the diversification and decentralization of power wherever possible, in order that the sovereignty of the individual is regarded as sacred. And I mean that literally, as well as in a way that is politically useful. And so my support of anyone that claims from within this system that they could make significant change is always tentative. But probably I'd be more pro Bobby Kennedy than Trump. I'd love to know what our audience think. I know that most of our audience are pretty pro-Trump. But when it comes to, like, you've brought up the pandemic and what an incredible journey of learning it afforded all of us. See how Trump maintains a degree of credit for the efficacy of warp speed, while clearly caught in the many Americans that now are furious about what happened in the pandemic period, who might loosely be corralled under the term anti-vax. How do you see that contradiction playing out for Trump, taking credit for the success of the vaccine, courting the support of anti-vaxxers?
Yeah, it's a very fair and important question, Russell. So let me just state my opinion. I was against the lockdowns, the masks very early, never took the mRNA shot called a vaccine. I think it was a huge mistake. I believe we were lied to by Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. And so I see that that's my opinion. I think, the audience would largely agree with me on there. And as far as with President Trump's record, I do want to just make it clear. He never forced the vaccine. He never was going to have any sort of punitive sort of measures. He also very early, his instincts were right. And I wish he would have trusted his instincts more. He was on how we can't lock down the country. Unfortunately, he was almost enveloped and he was suffocated by the medical bureaucrats around him. And so it was this kind of slow squeeze. It was the boa constrictor of the CDC and FDA here in the States, and the NHS would be the equivalent in your country. So as far as how President Trump navigates it, I did an entire podcast episode, Russell, a couple days ago, where I cautioned President Trump as a friend and a supporter. He has to be very careful politically taking credit for the vaccine, because there are millions of people that are sympathetic towards Trump, but the vaccine is a personal issue. They lost their job. They got kicked out of the military. They had a loved one suddenly, people with pericarditis and myocarditis and, they have other issues associated with the forced vaccination, or even just that they were told a lie. Hey, get one shot, so on and so forth. So my advice for President Trump is to say, hey, my instincts were to go for early treatments, and I was lied to by the pharmaceutical companies. I think it is a perfect opportunity. And President Trump is not a stranger to that kind of an argument. Think about it. How many times did he say that the FBI came after me? The intel agencies came after me. It is a continuation of a narrative. And I know you want to get in here. Just last thing I'll say really quick is that if President Trump says that these pharmaceutical companies came into the White House and told me one thing and we saw another, and as president, I will do a criminal investigation into the big four, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, I think he could break out of this potential political problem, especially with RFK running, who is nipping at his bud right now in regards to the vaccine issue.
I'll tell you what, I'm excited about this conversation that you and I are having already, because it's a legitimate conversation where I don't feel like I'm just trying to frame questions in order to establish a position, but I am genuinely interested. And in what you're saying, and in that spirit, if Trump, I love your suggestion. There should be an investigation into the activities of those companies rather than continually redacted documents and further support and further deals in our country. AstraZeneca have just done a £650 million deal with the government to build more factories. There's a revolving door between Pfizer and the FDA, Moderna and the FDA, and comparable agencies in our country. One question, though. If indeed Trump's defense for what happened in that rather unique and difficult period is to be that it was establishment mandarins and bureaucrats that strangled his authority, how can he claim that in a second term he will be able to impose authority in a distinct and different way? And will he, if he were to say that he was going to, would he not risk further accusations that what he was planning to bring to America was a form of dictatorship, which is precisely what his detractors on the neoliberal left are continually saying, whilst I recognise and consider, and just to let you know my position, I consider the biggest threat to our freedom to be the new strain of authoritarianism being all gird under the auspices of neoliberalism. That is the tyranny that we have to fear, no question about it. But how would Trump do things differently this time without playing into the hands of those that say he's going to slash bureaucracy and all that?
Yeah, so two things. Number one, you're right. The new authoritarianism, though, looks different than just a czar, a Caesar, or a king. The new authoritarianism is by committee. It's by oligarchy. It is by bureaucracy. It is by the secret society of intelligentsia that sit around and they agree that, the Faucis, the Birxes, they are largely the faceless, nameless, unidentified power structure within the Leviathan. So when people think of authoritarianism, they just think of Putin. When the new authoritarianism rests within the credentialed class, the managerial revolution that we've lived through the West. I'm happy to explore that, but I just wanted to expound on that. The second part, though, is this is why my recommendation for President Trump is he should say that, hey, as president, I'm going to put RFK in charge of a committee going after vaccine safety and the vaccine adverse event reporting system, which we call VAERS in the States. And personnel is policy. And the best answer I have to that, Russell, is the way that he can try and calm the anxiety and the nerves that some people have towards the kind of, let's just say, deep state machinations of the bureaucracy. The administrative state is another term that I like to use for these group of vultures that run our country, is that I'm going to have specific people that will dedicate their life 24/7 to try to rein in the beast. And so when it comes to the CDC or the FDA, first of all, politically, it'd be a huge winner. And I don't know what RFK would really do with that if President Trump came out and said, hey, I'm going to make RFK in charge of the special committee. For example, by the way, committees are not nothing. I want you to think about it. We had the Church and Pike Committee before. There's been like 9/11 commissions. And the 9/11 commission was largely flawed and, not exactly great, but it had a lot of attention, a lot of funding. There was the Warren Commission with the JFK assassination, which was a joke. But at times, some of these commissions and some of these, you actually learn something, the Church and Pike Committee being the best congressional example. I think we need a retroactive looking back at the crimes committed during COVID with the same sort of urgency that we would if there was a domestic terror attack. Like, oh, wow, how did these hijackers get in the country? Again, that was the spirit that triggered the 9/11 Commission. Again, it was a very lackluster report and it was missing a lot of stuff. However, the spirit that launched the investigation was a good one because people wanted answers. Where is that now, Russell? Why don't we get answers from these intel agencies? Why don't we get answers from, did we know that Anthony Fauci was potentially on the take from these pharma companies? So I'm not dodging the question. I'm saying President Trump has a couple challenges facing his second term, as politically and then actually from a policy perspective if he becomes president. The first of which is he has to convince certain voters that the personnel will be different. This is why my advice is name the names of the people that you're going to put in your government that have earned the trust. And secondly, his first month in office, I hope we see a lot of firings and a lot of turnover in the deep state administrative state.
Now, the keen-eyed or eared among you will have noticed that we had to censor a couple of words there. That was only for those of you that are watching it on YouTube. On Rumble, you would have heard Charlie Kirk's words in full. So take the opportunity and click the link in the description right now and join us for the rest of this conversation on Rumble. And if you're watching very carefully, you'll notice that at an almost indiscernible point in our conversation, bruises appeared on my face when I nipped out of the room, did a little bit of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and came back. Let's get back to our conversation with Charlie Kirk.